I joined the PhD program of the University of Pittsburgh in, I think it's now 1988. So a very long time ago. I can't remember much about it, but they have a master's program and then you join the PhD program, and I did it all at the University of Pittsburgh. So quite some time ago. The context of it was that I was required for my doctoral studies to do both a focus in international relations as well as comparative politics, to do both fields together. And so I needed to have an international dimension as well as wanting to have a comparative dimension. At the time, which was as I was starting to sort of define my research topic for my PhD, was the move to enhance the European single market. This was in 1992, big move to create a sense of, some people would call it a fortress Europe, some people would sort of say it's sort of a trade bloc. There's the whole notion at the time of trade blocs. And coming partially from international relations, my interest was, why are these states cooperating beyond the lowest common denominator that a lot of the international relations theories were thinking about? So why would states allow certain rules, certain institutions at the European level to be created if we accept certain international relations paradigms about state interest and trying to defend state interest? So I wanted to know why more enhanced cooperation was possible. And so one of the areas where cooperation seemed to be moving far beyond any expectations was with respect to the environment. And that sort of provided my focus. Initially, what I was trying to do was to look for a single explanation of why this cooperation happened. Was it interest or was it knowledge? And in the end, I decided to try a couple different hypotheses. And this brings us into epistemic communities, which I think is a question that we're going to come to later. So do knowledge communities enhance cooperation, or is it more interest? And so I decided to spend my time looking at various case studies to try to see what was the outcome of these policies. So with an idea of sort of doing policy tracing of the decision making from a certain point when the policy problem was being discussed, it was being defined, up to a policy solution. So I sort of had international relations questions, but was using more of a comparative public policy approach. Well, what I found was that it is possible, and the European Union environmental policy demonstrates this, to have these member states agree to regulations that's far beyond a lowest common denominator, where you're going to satisfy every member state. But these possibilities only operate under certain conditions. Have to happen. Conditions such as uncertainty, conditions such as sometimes less political visibility helps, if the issue is kept at the technical level. But more specifically, what I argue in the thesis is that in thinking about how the EU developed policies, the European Union, it was very important to not focus simply on agenda setting, right? Agenda setting is important. How do you define the policy problem? What sorts of solutions you propose? But it is simply in a complex governing system like the European Union, where you have a dual executive, so in a sense you've got the Commission, but you also have the leadership of the member states and the Council of Ministers. You've got a dual legislature, and you have the Commission drawing up laws, but the Council of Ministers having to ratify them, and actually the European Parliament also now increasingly involved in ratifying, modifying legislation, as well as the fact that the member states are implementing the legislation. With all these complex arenas, complex actors, you need, if you're going to maintain agenda setting, you need to have what I call in the thesis agenda maintenance. You need to have a strategy of keeping an issue and keeping a policy solution maintained through this complex web of arenas and through the different hurdles and veto points within the EU process. And to do that, I make the argument that one entrepreneur, because I was very interested in Kingdon's sort of thinking, one entrepreneur is not enough, because one entrepreneur may be very powerful in one institutional body or one part of the process. But what you're going to need is a coalition of entrepreneurs, whether they form an identifiable network or whether they're more unofficial, more ad hoc, more temporary in terms of their allegiances, who work the agenda over time and through the different hurdles in the process. But the findings of the book suggest that cases of high political visibility, very strong resistance from certain member state governments will block sort of innovation and rigor, can block high levels of ambition in terms of regulation, and you move back towards the lowest common denominator. So it isn't, there's no guarantee that any amount of good entrepreneurship necessarily leads to a particular outcome. My sense of the word monopoly is that it's sort of locked in. I don't see this as locked in. This is more of a having some kind of, not a grip, but a kind of presence. You have to be there. You have to have your ideas be present and being important. I think in the EU, given all the different actors, all the different arenas, you can't have a grip on the policy. You have to persuade people. You have to deal with alternatives. You have to. So I think it's very difficult to get a kind of a monopoly in such a system. I was in the United States system, which means I had a committee made up of 5 individuals, but the chair of the committee was B. Guy Peters, right? So and the kind of informal co-chair, I mean, she had a sort of co-chair role. It was Alberta Sabraja. So this is at the University of Pittsburgh, and they are the 2 comparative public policy people. But I also had 3 international relations people as well. So it's a big committee. It's the U.S. system of committees. But Guy was the chair. I think Guy is not one of those people who says, he doesn't ask you to adopt a theory, all right? Sort of says, here's my approach, you buy into it or not. He's not one of those people. which was good because I could come up with my own theories. What Guy in particular got me to do was to think comparatively, and I think maybe more importantly, to realize that bureaucratic politics can be fun. You know, that it is interesting seeing the play of power. Lots of people think that's the boring stuff, but often the most important decisions, particularly in the European Union context, where much of the decision is technical decision making on aspects of how you regulate standards for parts of automobiles and so forth, right? And so those are decisions which could have a great economic importance, but aren't going to have a lot of political visibility. And often those decisions are very important, but not necessarily political, but still interesting because of that. And I think the third thing is Guy's approach always was, you know, don't try to perfect it. Get a draft of the chapter. Get the next draft of the chapter, and you know, don't worry so much about what the finished product was. He was very much a believer in you know, get a draft of the next chapter. I remember at the end of my viva, he asked me, he congratulated me, said, "Well done. How's the next book coming?" so there was always you know, a focus forward, and you know, I think that is important. Well, I didn't. It took me a while to come up with a book project because I was learning a new university system, and so I sort of focused on journal articles for a number of years. But essentially, on the basis of my interest in the PhD, I spent some time sort of doing more work on networks, particularly epistemic communities. I looked at the role of policy ideas, looking at concepts like framing, and I started to get into instruments. And the sort of big joint project which I managed to get a UK Research Council grant with Rudy Wurtzel at the University of Hull and Andrew Jordan at the University of East Anglia. That grant project was on environmental policy instruments, and that in the end sort of became the next big book project. I mean, we spent over a decade gathering information and publishing things. So all those things sort of were interests that I started to register as a PhD student, but then started to develop afterwards. Well, I think it's important to note I formed the view in my PhD that in my doctoral research I actually discovered one. All right, in hindsight I'm quite surprised that I did, and I'll explain why I'm in retrospect surprised by that. But I found an epistemic community in one of the three cases I was doing for my thesis, but not the other two. And even in the one case, its influence, I think, was important, but it was not decisive in influencing how the European Union decided the particular policy problem. Lots of other factors were involved in it. So what I realized over time, starting from that sort of research finding, was that there don't seem to be that many epistemic communities that fit Peter Haas's very strict criteria of how epistemic communities have certain core ideas that have to be shared closely with the group. There just aren't that many communities out there that have this ongoing, strong presence and identification with a core research program. There are networks of knowledge experts, but they're often more ad hoc, more temporary, more changeable, more contested about the ideas. And so I think what's happened in terms of my own thinking is that I've tended to either decide to broaden the concept away from the narrow criteria that Haas stressed, or look at different kinds of sort of ways in which knowledge is translated and knowledge is used as power. I mean, the epistemic community framework was useful in the sense that it raised a challenge that it wasn't simply material power that mattered, whether economic power or military power, which were a lot of the traditional international relations theories. But since Peter Haas published sort of the initial work, which sort of happened during my PhD, you had people in science and technology studies influenced by Foucault and Latour, and and you have a much more nuanced sense about knowledge and how knowledge works. So I think the concept has some uses. I still think that's the case, but I think it sort of explains a limited amount of activities and processes that are out there, and the wider sense of knowledge communities, I think, is going to be essential to get at the role that experts can play. I think you have again, as I said before, you've got the possibility that the experts move around more, that they don't necessarily share closely the same paradigm, the same method. There may be differences in methods. They might be multidisciplinary and having an interest in a core problem, but may have different solutions or different aspects of the solutions that they provide without having necessarily a core paradigm. So I think network concepts still are useful to look at experts, but I think, and so for that reason, I think there is a lot of mileage in advocacy coalitions, for instance, which had more of a looser sense of what sort of that there's a sort of core knowledge, but not necessarily one with certain of the assumptions about how science and knowledge work that I think you find in the epistemic community one. I mean, to be fair, I think some network approaches, like issue networks, always were aware of the possibility that that networks might matter, but not necessarily have a tight definition, structure, membership. So I think even from the early days of Hugh Heclo and people like that, there was a realization that networks will vary depending on who's involved, how long the network has been in operation, what the interests are, and so forth. And so I think that recognition is there, and then it becomes more of an empirical question about the degree to which these networks have a tight community where they extract certain membership, have certain membership expectations about your behavior, certain resources are exchanged, versus more looser networks. I think the network approaches, I've always realized that the different possibilities are there. I'm not sure every academic, in terms of using network theory, has always been aware of that nuance, right? So I think there's a lot of network approaches that sort of assumed, a lot of applications of the network theories that assumed that you had these nice tight boundaries that in reality or you can't assume that it's an empirical investigation that you have to do. Well, it's difficult because, I mean, Sabatier's view has influenced me, right? So I'm not, it's a bit, it's, I think I'm, I am more, if you had to put me on a continuum of sort of empiricists, and Sabatier was a careful empiricist with a particular methodological focus on positivism and so forth. I probably am a bit further in the middle. You know, not, I wouldn't say I'm a pure constructivist, although people have labeled me as that. But I think I'm probably further along in the ideas that certain kind of knowledge, certain kinds of things, influence may be harder to measure in the sort of a strict sense that a Sabatier would have expected the research to go. So I think I probably differ from him, but on saying that the general approach is always influenced, you know, as with Peter Haas, has influenced my thinking about the intersection of knowledge and interest. So I don't reject. You know, I'm certainly not in a position to reject is sort of core argument about the role of ideas and the role of knowledge. So, but I think I probably would view it as I think that the role of this knowledge in a particular context is going to be more influenced by certain discursive patterns, by certain power relationships that the traditional advocacy coalition framework was less focused on picking up. All right, so it's slightly different epistemological emphasis, but I wouldn't want to push that too far. The first thing I would stress is that it is a multi-dimensional concept. It really is. And there's a real danger that people don't get a sense of the complexity involved. You know, for instance, well, I think there are a number of aspects, a number of conditions that are at work in any learning situation. First of all, you have to have the context. For example, is there uncertainty about the policy problem? That could be one way of shaping the context. How visible is the policy problem? All right, so those things matter in terms of the nature of learning. It might be very difficult for a group of policymakers to explore things when they're in sort of an urgent crisis situation or a high visibility situation. I think you have to look at the nature of the learners. You know, who's learning? What sort of situation are they in? What capacity do they have to learn? What's their background? What's their receptivity? Are they being receptive to the potential for learning? If they exist, you might have to look at the nature of the teachers. Who's teaching these people the things that they're learning? Are these self-learning with certain assumptions? Are they being taught by people in the same organization or a different organization or a different country with particular views, particular understandings and experiences that they've had that they're trying to push onto the learners? What is the nature of what's being learned? And I think here we can't assume, I mean, learning suggests something that is transformative, but it could be more evolutionary knowledge as opposed to revolutionary knowledge, right? So that notion of single loop learning where you know, there is feedback, but it isn't trying to change the nature of the thinking. behind the policy process. But equally, you can have, I think, learning situations where it's more symbolic politics is going on. That they're talking, oh, learning is happening and so forth. They're using the rhetoric of it, but nothing really transformative is happening in how the actual policy process works. And another thing that I think is important is that in thinking about policy learning, a lot of time is spent on understanding the problem, how to solve it. But part of that understanding, to my mind, has to involve an understanding of the political process and of how to do politics. And you can have, as we're seeing in the UK at the moment, people in power who don't necessarily understand how to negotiate or even how the European Union works. So if you don't have that learning of how a political system works, you might be at a disadvantage in negotiations. I think if you look at the people who have explicitly used the learning concept, for one thing, they've never agreed on a definition, right? There's multiple definitions out there. I've tried to have my own go at a version, but in a sense, if you compare that to, say, a Sabatier advocacy coalition, where he's got a very clear research agenda with a clear explanation and a methodological approach to do that, and you can sign up to that, or Eleanor Ostrom, that research program has never been developed for policy learning, unless you argue that part of the advocacy coalition framework is about policy learning, all right? And so there's the possibility of ideas being developed and ideas changing as a new coalition comes into being, gains political power. But beyond someone like Sabatier's framework, there hasn't been a kind of layering of the same strategic research method and process in most of the policy layering. Various people have done various different things. Sometimes they're closer to each other. Sometimes they're quite different. So you have things like policy transfer, which sort of has its own definitions. And, you know, the research is being done on that. But I think, as with many public policy, and for that matter political science concepts, when you often don't have agreements on the definitions, it's going to be very hard to build a large research program. And people pick it up, and to the degree that they're interested, they'll pursue it, but they'll tend to do it within their own sort of subset of people, and it tends not to, that the knowledge doesn't build upon itself. I think that's true of a lot. But I think learning is one of those concepts that is difficult. It's conceptually difficult. It is empirically difficult to do work on. And that means that having a kind of core research program is difficult. I mean, it is possible. I think Sabatier's work does indicate that it is possible to build such a research program. So I don't want to give the wrong impression about it, but I think it is difficult. And if you don't have a kind of figure that's trying to create a school like an Eleanor Ostrom did in the presence, then that kind of research program will be in fits and starts. People are interested in the concept, and they pick it up and do their own thing with it, redefine what learning is, you know, have a different set of the concepts, and they do it, and then someone else picks it up, and so it goes. But I mean, international relations spend a lot of time looking at learning, and a similar thing happened, right? The realist paradigms had lots of people buying into it and the core message and so forth, whereas the learning often, you know, you had a set of scholars who were interested in it, but you didn't have I think a layering of people over the decades in comparison to a lot of the mainstream international relations approaches. Yeah, I mean, they're both very variable, right? I think my sense of learning in international relations is that you either had a kind of Haas approach, sort of focused on knowledge, influenced to some extent by Foucault and all that, versus a kind of more psychology of politics. And now the psychology of politics could involve looking at individuals or small groups, the kind of groupthink sort of frameworks. Or they could look at sort of perceptions and misperceptions like Jervis and trying to build sort of systems of how uh, how political actors try to gain knowledge about a particular situation. So I think, in contrast, the policy learning has focused more on kind of sectoral public policy, less macro level, how states cooperate, the problems states face, and more kind of policy problems within a particular context. So, it's not coincidental that Sabatier's focus, even though he did write sort of how you could apply his framework to the European Union, a lot of what his focus was on certain Californian environmental problems where he studied the groups and so forth. So I think there is a difference in the level of analysis and the level of generalization that the two approaches tend to. But on saying that, I mean, international relations has a mixed bag. So there were people doing sort of the psychology of individual leaders and how they approach things and what are their blind spots and so forth as well. So they're both, I think, quite varied in terms of the approaches within them. So it's hard, unlike some of the other international relations paradigms of realism or whatever, if you want to call them paradigms, not everyone would accept that. There isn't one cohesive group of thinking about international relations learning or the psychology of politics, to my mind. Of the two, between international relations and public policy, well, I think the realization that you have a lengthy process by which things happen, I think that recognition of the nature of how decisions are taken, I think tends to be more nuanced in certain public policy literature. Now, obviously, there are people working on foreign policy analysis and international relations that, in the same way, take a long-term look at how decisions evolve over time. So it's difficult to generalize, but I think understanding the nature of how environmental policy works, some of the nature of the different stages in the policy process, the fact that the stages may not be linear, they may not follow in a neat sequence, are all things where I think the policy learning and comparative public policy has a greater nuance in terms of how it's approaching that. But again, that's generalizing over two fields where there are lots of different people who will argue lots of different things. So I think you can always point out, but there's someone in foreign policy analysis, and there are people that have very nuanced approaches to how decision-making work and the different stages in the process. So it's tricky to to make that kind of generalizations in what are two very diverse fields. Yeah. Policy learning for me encapsulates two sort of basic concepts. So I think of policy learning in terms of looking at particular policy problems, trying to create solutions, as opposed to sort of the more political dimensions of learning. So I first have that distinction. But then I think there is an important sense of whether the policy learning is sort of more adaptive adjustments over time, or is it trying to reframe the whole knowledge involved in that? So I think there's sort of two core distinctions I'd make in terms of my own definition of policy learning. But someone has asked me this recently, and actually in any of the work I've done, whenever I used policy learning, I've just used it in a very generic sense. I don't actually in any of my work define it as a particular way of doing things. So I've tended to either sort of rely on someone like Peter Hall in terms of how they've approached some of these things, rather than spending a lot of time defining it myself. Because this is one of the dangers in such a field, is that, all right, here's Zito's new definition of policy learning, and how does it differ from the other 10 and 15? So I think at certain points you have to make a decision. If you want to differentiate your own definition, have a different definition, why do you want to do that? Or is it better just in a sense to rely on some of the others that are out there? Is this a battle that you want to fight, to sort of say, well, I have a better definition or not? And sometimes I think it makes sense when a concept, you disagree with a concept, or you think you have an insight into it, yeah, to push for a particular definition. But where you think, I don't have much to add here. So I think, yeah, this sort of general single loop versus double loop in the context of trying to explain how policies work is where I'm at. Now one of the case studies in the PhD thesis was looking at one of the failures to cooperate in the European Union. Failure might be a harsh word, but the policy, in fact, was proposed to create a carbon energy tax, but it didn't, in fact, gain sufficient success to get onto the books. And from that point, it struck me that there was an element about looking at public policy and environmental policy and the nature of how tools are designed, how people think about tools. That's a separate and very important element to how policy actually happens. And in talking with a couple people also working on European Union environmental policy, I mentioned their names before, Rudy Wurtzel and Andy Jordan, we realized actually we had a common interest, but we were particularly, it was at a moment where the European Union, the United Nations, the OECD, were all talking about the fact that we could really protect the environment by making innovative policies. But a lot of the thinking behind it was quite was driven by a number of economists, and sometimes environmental economists. Many of them have a nuanced picture of instruments, but a lot of the argumentation had very little sense of the political, very little sense of a political context. So it's sort of thinking, oh, well, we'll create an emissions trading scheme. How does it work? How do you make it work in a political context, which is already heavy with ministries, other policy instruments. How do you fit these things? It's all very well to sort of say that that an emissions trading scheme, it gives you an efficient way of setting prices and therefore reducing emissions. But if you don't have the experts in the bureaucracies to create such a system, well, where do you get the knowledge from? If they're more comfortable with taxation policy, are you, and your country traditionally has used tax as a way of giving financial incentives, how easy is it going to be to create emissions trading systems? And so we decided in a number of countries in the European Union to try to explore the rise in interest in new schemes and to juxtapose that with the more traditional instruments, regulation, and how much of the portfolio of instruments that we see in the countries evolve over time, bringing in these newer instruments. Because of course, we're very careful in the publications to put new in quotation marks, because taxes have existed. There have been schemes of creating artificial market systems to regulate stuff for many decades before the United States sort of became particularly interested in emissions trading in the 80s and onwards. So very little of these policies, if you can find historical equivalents. The French had a tax policy, environmental tax policy of a kind much earlier, and so these things have always existed. But what you saw in the 80s as the more interest in climate change, the issues of climate change, you saw both policymakers and policy experts sort of reach for, well, we need, given these difficult global problems, we need to reach for new innovation, smart regulation, which might mean not regulation, but other kinds of more voluntary instruments, ones that put more burden on the people doing the polluting to monitor themselves, to police themselves, and so forth. So this interest was out there, but there was a number of questions about whether, in fact, these instruments were that successful. How thoroughly were they being implemented into the system, and were they in fact displacing regulation? And in the project I did with Rudy and Andy, we found that actually in most cases a lot of the regulatory structure remained, and you had sometimes instruments feed into this, with a few exceptions, the EU emissions trading scheme being quite a major thing. But climate change was always a difficult issue to get a regulation as the United States federal system is finding out today. But in other areas, water policy, air policy, a lot of the core thing of what the European Union had done has remained rules, has remained regulation, and they've nuanced this by adding often some new instruments. But what you actually see, I think one of the things that the study of new environmental policy instruments has the danger of obscuring is the fact that a lot of the innovation in how the environment is governed might be by evolving the rules, the more traditional instruments, and the changes you see with those instruments may have actually be more meaningful, more significant, and more important in the long term in terms of how the attempt to change public policy has really worked. And so some of the more interesting story is not the addition of eco-labels or these things, but more how the European Union and its individual actors have rethought questions of regulation, how to streamline it, how to make it better, how to make it more effective, how to make it more flexible. I, I think there are countries where they the focus is essentially been on taking EU environmental policy, where they are not trying to innovate. That the EU sets certain policies and they're going to largely adhere to them. But I think it's tricky to make an argument about leaders, because some of the traditional countries seen as leaders, let's take Germany, for instance. Germany did certainly push on certain kinds of policy instruments very hard. They had a very early eco-labeling scheme. They had a very particular view of regulation that specified certain strict criteria. But they were very reluctant and very resistant, for instance, to the idea of an emission trading scheme. Whereas countries like the United Kingdom and the Netherlands were more interested in those kinds of instruments. And so to say that a country like Germany was a leader, I think is true on certain environmental policy aspects and true on certain environmental policy instruments, but not necessarily true in all issue areas. There are areas where Germany, in a sense, was a reluctant acceptor of some of the policies as well as some of the instruments. So it isn't a case, it's a danger of sort of saying, oh, that Germany is always a green leader, just as the, some people, particularly in Britain, sort of say, well, Britain is always the dirty man of Europe. In some sense, in certain areas, Britain has tried to lead as well, both in terms of policy as well as the design of those policies and the instruments. I think part of it is the if you look at these countries, they have certain traditions that they've developed for policies that have worked for them. They have a bureaucracy that's familiar with these policies, and there is a benefit in the sense of trying to what they call in the Europeanization literature, upload the policies that you're most comfortable with to the EU. And that means that when the EU agrees a common policy, well, you don't have to adjust so much your own member states' policies. And I think you also have differences in the sort of the entrepreneurs who become interested. So in the United States, for instance, you had certain people in the EPA who had a very strong interest in emissions trading. And one guy, I'm not sure it was intentional, but he ended up being in the U.S. Congress for a while. Then he ended up in the United States Environmental Protection Agency, all pushing this, this one kind of idea. And so you have the case that you have momentum sometimes building, you have coalitions supporting certain kinds of instruments in the particular country. And another example is the fact that the British, for instance, developed relatively early management standards, right? How businesses could improve themselves by auditing their own processes, whether it's personnel or or their production processes, whatever. And of course, a logical extension of that was environmental, all right? And so you had a natural predisposition because of the strength of the standards bodies and these to have an interest in promoting these kinds of standards approaches. My view on how it's changed, I mean, all I can offer you is my view. I can answer the second question. You have to ask a number of people to get a sense of the first. I think a couple things have happened that I can identify. I'm sure other people will give you a very different list. But one thing that has happened is that I think there's more methodological and epistemological differences, right? So you had a whole post-empiricist, Frank Fisher, lots of people coming in, bringing in notions from Foucault and so forth. But at the same time, you also had people more of the positivist quantitative analysis. I think there's a lot more methodological as well as epistemological pluralism in the field. I sort of, when I was reading in the 80s some of the public policy literature, he tended to have a certain kind of qualitative overview. You know, I mean, that's exaggerating it because there obviously were people interested in those dimensions even at that time. So you had people like Wildowski and Douglas working on cultural sort of studies of bureaucracy and behavior. So I don't want to over-egg that one, but I think you have a lot more systematic investment in a lot of these new and different approaches. So that's one thing. I think while agenda setting, Kingdon, some people working on problem definition existed, Sabatier in creating the ACF actually had a focus on policy implementation. I think there is a lot more sustained interest in things, you know, other aspects of the policy process. Some, you know, like evaluation and monitoring, and you know, there's more been a, you know, policy design. There's been a more conscious effort to try to build up a research program looking at bits of the policy process. A third change is I'm not sure how successful it's been, but certainly there's been a conscious effort on the part of you know, discussions, for instance, at a conference like this, to try to identify sort of the big approaches, to make it so that, yeah, there are certain sort of identifiable approaches. Now, I'm not sure at the end of the day whether the field will actually embrace that, but you have a certain accumulation of people working on Sabatier's approach versus a multiple streams Kingdon approach and so forth. And I think more people feel that they have to sort of at least systematically acknowledge that, you know, there are some dominant approaches as well as people doing more eclectic things. If I think through sorts of things that I see, I'd suggest maybe those are some of the bigger changes. But I'm sure someone else would come up with an entirely different list. A lot depends on just your personal experience. Over time, I think comparative public policy has recognized that many of the policy problems are just international in nature, and that requires, you know, that kind of approach, looking at international actors, looking at exogenous shocks, whether it's the global financial crisis or what have you. And so there has to be an international dimension to that. I'm not so sure for international relations that they spend much time, a lot of the perspectives, thinking too much about comparative public policies. And so that, but I think that's generally true of international relations because of the sort of the view on, key debates and so forth. They've often tend to focus on doing their thing. But I think certainly in terms of public policy, there is a recognition that many of the problems we have are complex and they're nested in other problems, and inevitably this has a kind of an international reality that if to try to find policy solutions, you have to address the challenges that the international arena provides, as well, to put it more positively, as potential solutions, whether it's borrowing ideas or getting economic support, although that can have its negative connotations, or whatever sort of experiences and interactions you have which could build better policy solutions. So I think there is a recognition, just because the nature of a lot of the issues, environmental policy, economic policy, are shaped. It is an interdependent world, and I think most policy scholars recognize that at some level that their work has to acknowledge that.